Hello, everyone. We are going to take a few minutes to just let people join the webinar. Ooh, I'm sorry about that. Let me get all my things together. I was just telling Natania, I feel like I should have 5 screens when I'm doing a webinar.
It would be helpful.
This is exactly why. Feel free to let us know where you are dialing in from, and I'm going to work on getting the presentation back up.
You got this, Lexi. I believe in you.
And then we will get started. Oh, let me make sure that chat is also enabled for everybody. Okay, attendees can chat with host and panelists. All right. Okay, so now that you can actually do that, feel free to let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. I'm in North Carolina currently. And Natania, where are you?
I'm in Oakland.
Oakland. Okay.
Yeah, where we really happily have a low AQI today, which is something that I didn't know about until the past week. I still don't really understand enough about, but I know that it's green today, which is a very good.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, we in North Carolina, we had some smoky days last week. And it was sadly like nothing compared to when I lived in California. So
I was calling my California family to be like, what is this and how do I function? And very sadly, they had a lot of helpful advice.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get started. First, we would love to hear from you all. Today is an Ask Me Anything, so it really is going to be Natania answering your questions. So if you have one on your mind, the Q&A function is going to be a great place to share that with us. And right now, we'd love for you to go to mentee.com and enter this code. I will share this in the chat as well. And just let us know what you're hoping to get out of today's session. So I'll share a link in the chat right now, and you can just click on that link. And then I will also just share the code again. And so if you go there and you can share what you're hoping to get out of today's session, it will show up on the screen here. And feel free to let me know if anyone's having trouble accessing that. It could just be you're hoping to hear some good answers, you're hoping to get your question answered, or you're just hoping to, feel a little bit more confident in the DEI work that you're currently doing. Natania, what are you hoping to get out of today's session?
Quite frankly, and it's totally fine if any of you are in this boat too, I'm just looking for a really nice break in my day to talk about some stuff I care about. I love answering questions from people who are curious about DEI. It totally brightens my mood. So that's one of my biggest hopes for today. I'm also just really curious. I often find when I ask people like, what questions do you have about DEI? I get kind of blank. I'm met with a blank stare. And then when we keep talking, it turns out someone has a lot of questions about DEI, and they weren't sure if they were okay to ask, which is part of why we're allowing you to ask questions anonymously today if you want to, or they didn't quite know how to ask it and needed to work through it, which I'm totally happy to do. So I'm also hoping for all of you that today's session gives you some space to work through anything that's feeling kind of sticky around DEI right now, and helps you get to a place where maybe it still feels sticky because DEI is really sticky work, but you at least have a better understanding of the lay of the land around that.
Beautiful. And we have one response here, which is to learn more about how to talk with executives about their role in DEI work, which I think this is definitely something that we saw in a few of the pre-submitted questions is about, with executives or leadership, or specifically with a CEO, how do you talk to them? How to attract more diverse talent, white women's role in DEI work. I think these are all great things. Natania, any you want to talk about specifically at this moment?
Oh my gosh, I'd love to talk about all three. I could talk about each of them for about an hour, so I'll do my best to keep my questions quick. I do see, Lexi, in the chat, someone's asking, just for clarification, Natalie, you can put your question in the Menti, is where we'd love to see it.
Menti.com, and then that code, I'll post it again.
Maybe while questions are coming in, I'm happy to talk about, let's just jump right in with white women's role in DEI work. That's a really juicy one. And as a white woman, something that I think about a lot, because it's really easy for white women to do a lot of harm in DEI work. I think gender was one of the first areas where DEI work started to actually get funding and attention from white-led organizations, because it's where they felt most comfortable leaning into DEI work. And what happens, as many of you probably know, when we approach DEI work and we only look at gender, we end up further oppressing other historically excluded and oppressed groups. So when we are women and we are white, we need to think about both of those identity groups and what it means to be part of, as many of us are, some groups that have been historically excluded and oppressed, and other groups that have been historically overrepresented and have been oppressors. And so there's a lot of responsibility that we hold. As white women in particular, I think it's really important to make sure that we remember every single moment of every single day that women have lots of other identities too, right? And so when I think about my experience as a woman, that's my experience as a white, queer, Jewish, disabled, you name all, I could go on for a while with all of my identities, woman. And that's a really different experience than the experiences, in this case, we're talking about women of color, right? And when we talk about the term intersectionality, that was actually a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the very specific overlapping forms of oppression and distinct forms of oppression that Black women face that are actually really different than the forms of oppression that white women face, and it cannot be described simply by saying Black women face oppression that is equal to white women oppression plus Black man oppression. It's actually really different and distinct. And so when white women are doing DEI work, I think what we need to remember is, to answer your question bluntly, we only have one perspective. And what is our responsibility as people who maybe strive to be allies to, in this case, people of color, to lift up those perspectives and to do what is being asked of us by oppressed groups that we're not part of.
Great answer. I will leave this up for us, and I'm gonna jump back to the presentation because we have a little bit of housekeeping and then introductions too. I think some of you probably know Natania, some of you know me, you might have gotten an email from me. So we'll introduce ourselves and then we'll keep it rolling. So a little bit of housekeeping for today. To ask Natania a question, it's ideal to use the Q&A function. So you should be this little, should have this little kind of 2 messages icon on your toolbar, and you can ask a question there. And then you can also upvote questions that you really want to hear answered. And you can ask a question anonymously if you don't want it to be attributed to you. To chat with panelists and attendees, you can use the chat feature. And then to enable captions, there's the little more with 3 dots on your toolbar, and then you can click that and enable a live transcript. It is, I would say, like 80% accurate. So just take it with a grain of salt. I will also share all this in the webinar chat as well, so you have it there, and you will be getting the recording of today's session. So with that out of the way, a little about PIN. I am Lexi. I'm the head of marketing at PIN, and we are an employee experience platform that supports companies in building their ideal employee journey. And we do this by powering automations through human resources information systems data. And we are also working on an employee journey mapper tool that is coming soon. So thank you for joining us today. We are super glad to have Natania here. Natania is not only our webinar speaker, but she also works with us at PIN, and we've worked on a few projects internally. So I was really excited that she wanted to do this today. So I'll let Natania share a little bit about her experience as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Lexi. Hi, everyone. I'm Natania. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I like when you use them interchangeably. So if you don't have anyone in your life or a lot of people in your life who only use they, them, I'm an awesome person to practice with because I won't know if you screw up and use she, her, because those are my pronouns too. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And I like to explain what that means because I think it actually means something different for every DEI consultant you talk to. So what that means for me is that I work with organizations that have really strong intentions and sometimes even explicit values around how demographically diverse they want their staff to be, the sense of inclusion they want those staff to feel at work, and how equitably they want to be treating those staff to create and foster that sense of inclusion and maybe even belonging. And then they have some questions and sometimes even concerns because organizations are run by people and people are imperfect about how well they're actually living those values or intentions day to day. And so I work with organizations like PIN to figure out what that gap is between intention and impact. What are strategies that we can use to bridge that gap? And then we implement those strategies together. And sometimes I also come in to help an organization get from like point D to point E on their journey to help just move things along at whatever point they're ready for. So there's a smattering of some of the organizations I've worked with. Of course, PIN goes on there too. And really looking forward to hearing what's on your mind today. Oh, Lexi, you're muted.
Classic. Wow. Classic Zoom move. Okay. So when we had the registration page up, we asked folks to submit questions upon registration. And then we also asked you to sort of rank which of these topics you would most be interested in hearing about, or most want to hear questions answered about. So the topic ranking that we ended up with was number 1, folks are looking for information on how to define a sustainable DEI strategy. After that, how to measure DEI success. And then lastly, having a limited budget for DEI work. So if you're thinking of your question, this is in no mean like you can only ask questions about this. These are just to kind of give you some guardrails or guidelines if you are looking for kind of a jumping off point for the questions that you have today. And one more thing that we will do before we get into the questions, and we do have one person asking their question live, is this poll. So I will launch this poll now. So if you can take a look at the poll, it should show up on your screen and just answer the question, what resourcing does DEI currently have in your organization? So the results of this poll are going to help Natania, sort of inform the answers that they're providing. So, I think if you are volunteer only, the answer that Natania might give might be very different than if you have a full DEI staff. So I'll leave that up there for a few more seconds because we have about 50% participation. Anything you want to add on this, Natania?
I'll also try to cater my answers. So if I know that the vast majority of people have a full team that handles DEI work in their organization, I'm going to give you really different answers than if I know that the vast majority of people here are running DEI using only volunteer resources, right? So this is just going to help me make sure that I'm giving you answers that are actually useful for the folks who are in the room.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I will share those results as well. So it looks like we have 50% of folks are volunteer only, and Natania is shaking her head. 30% have someone who handles DEI as part of their paid work. 15% have someone who handles DEI as the full scope of their paid work. 10% work with a paid consultant, and 5% have a team that handles DEI as the full scope of their paid work. So looking at a lot of volunteer only, and then someone who's doing this as a portion of their full-time job. Okay, I will stop sharing that poll. And then if you give me just a moment, we will hopefully have our first live question. So let's see, Kaylee, I should be able to promote you to a panelist, and then you'll rejoin the webinar as a panelist, and then you should be able to ask your question. So she'll be back in just a minute. I didn't realize it would kick her out. There we are. That wasn't too long of a wait. Kaylee, thank you for asking your question live. And do you want to you can share a little bit about yourself if you'd like, or just jump right into your question.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
You're a little soft if you want to raise your mic volume.
Okay. I'll speak loud. I don't know how to raise it.
Sounds good. I can hear you, so I can also repeat your question for folks who can't.
Perfect. I'm an employee experience coordinator at a tech company. So one of our big focuses for the year is global and scalable diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. My kind of lens that I'm viewing this through is I work a lot with our system administration, so our HRIS. So we're working to kind of configure what we're collecting in that system and who we're collecting it for. So my question specifically was, what advice do you have for navigating DEI on a global multicultural scale? We are a global company. We've got lots of folks around the world. And how do you choose what information to collect, given the different attitudes towards certain DEI related movements around the world?
And Kaylee, when you say different attitudes towards DEI movements around the world, I just want to make sure I'm not making assumptions, because we know what happens when people do that. Do you mean like relative, like people who are really excited about more progressive DEI movements versus in other areas, people might be more wary or scared of starting these conversations? Or is there something different that you're alluding to there?
That's essentially what we're getting to. We've got a lot of folks in areas of the world where it's still a taboo subject for them. And so things that we would ask our US employees we're kind of gauging, is that appropriate to ask in these locations? Also looking into the legality of asking and collecting this information in certain areas. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for asking live, Kaylee. It's always helpful to get that added color and context for what you're asking for. I think actually there may be folks right now who are listening thinking, well, I'm not a global company, so this doesn't apply to me. And I would ask you to just hang on, because I think it actually does. Whenever an organization is trying to think about what questions should we be asking to collect data, I never answer, and I always just ask back, what are your goals? What are you trying to do with DEI? If your DEI work is successful, what will that look like? Only once we know that can we actually figure out what data do we need to collect to figure out what's our baseline relative to those goals, and then what does that mean about where we need to move forward? My guess is that as a global company, and this is true for any distributed organization, you'll probably have some goals that are company-wide, right? So no matter where people are in the world, it's important to us to live our company values around X, Y, and Z things that are related to DEI. And so we need to collect some data around that. Maybe that has to do with collecting certain kinds of demographic data, right? Maybe that has to do with collecting data related to specific aspects of employee experience. There's probably something in there related to collecting data that tells you about hiring rates, promotion rates, exit rates, as related to demographic identity, right? There's probably some universal things you're looking at related to your overall DEI goals. And then you probably have regionally specific things that you want to ask about, and that's okay. Just make sure they're actually related to regional goals. We never want to collect data that we don't know what we're going to do with it, right? Whenever we're asking employees questions, we want to make sure that there's a reason we're asking the question, it's related to some goals, and then we're actually going to take action based on what we hear. And so the other underlying thing that I hope you're taking away from that answer is never Google, what should I ask in my DEI survey, and just use those questions, right? Those aren't for you. Those are for folks who are volunteers running DEI work that have no time to do this at all. And even in that case, using those questions in a DEI survey often causes more harm than good because they're unrelated to your overall DEI goals and DEI strategy. You're usually not prepared to take action based on them. And then employees are left sitting around thinking, I took this time to give you this information. What are you actually doing with it? So with a strategy like that, you can really customize to make sure, okay, in different locations, I'm asking about gender in the way that people actually talk about gender in that country, in that region of the world. I'm asking about race in a way that actually makes sense in this region of the world, because we talk about race so differently depending on where we are, right? I'm asking about experience in a way that makes sense given the cultural norms in this part of the world where everybody takes lunch at the same time. That's really normal. It's a part of the workday versus over here where people take lunch at their desk, whether or not we think that's a healthy thing, right? So think globally, think goal-oriented, and then customize to be regionally specific.
Fantastic. Do you have any follow-up, Kaylee, questions?
No, thank you.
Awesome.
So
Thank you so much. I am going to pop you back into being a attendee, and hopefully that's not too disruptive for you. Thanks for trying this out with us. It's the first time we've done a live promo. All right. Now we are going to go back to our list of some of the pre-submitted questions, and we'll kind of pop between that and the Q&A function. So please feel free to drop your questions in there. Again, you can ask them anonymously. I see some folks have taken advantage of that. And then you can also upvote if there are questions you're really interested in hearing answered. So one of the other questions that we took from the pre-submitted batch is, how do you balance the leadership pressure to move fast when it comes to DEI work with really getting it right?
This is a question that I confront with almost every single one of my clients. I think the pressure to move fast comes from a place that I don't want to discount, right? Which is we feel our employees asking us to make a change. And so we want them to see that we are listening to them and making a change, right? Sometimes it's a performative, like we want to check this box to say that we've done the work and then be done with it. And that I would always push back on because performative DEI work is always harmful. But we want to understand what the urgency is behind the request from executive so that we can work with that in a way that acknowledges the real place it's coming from, and then devise a strategy that is responsible in the long term. Usually the way that we can marry those two pressures is by communicating effectively about our strategy. So something that I will often share is that effective DEI work is about 50% the actual substantive work that you're doing, and then 50% how you communicate about the work that you're doing. One of the reasons I like working with PIN that focuses entirely on employee communications. So if you're doing really good DEI work, but it's all behind the scenes, for example, you put together a really good, you did a really great pay equity analysis, you have amazing salary bands, you've done pay equity audits, you know that you are paying all of your staff super fairly across every demographic category that you can think of, but you've never communicated any of that to your staff. Bummer. You're not going to see any of the benefits of that. Your staff are going to leave because they are going to assume they're not being paid well because most people in the US are paid inequitably, right? You have to communicate about what you're doing and share about it in order to actually see the benefits. And the great news for execs who are feeling that pressure about, I want to move quickly and get some quick wins, is that you can often get quick wins by communicating about what you're doing or what you plan to do and how staff can be engaged in it. And when there's low-hanging fruit, you can just do what's being asked, right? So if you have a really long-term strategy, let's just keep going with the salary band example. If you have a long-term strategy to eventually create salary bands, but you're not ready yet for whatever reason, maybe one of the things you want to communicate to staff is, we hear you asking about pay equity. We take that seriously. Here's our timeline for doing a pay equity analysis, creating salary bands. You can expect to hear from us about what salary band you fall into by Q1 of 2024, whatever it is, right? Communicate that. And if there are things that staff are asking for that you can actually just do, and you don't have to wait, then just do them. Those are your quick wins. And there are more of them than you would think that there are.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think obviously I'm biased, but I think communication is super important. And I think that's great advice in terms of, taking the quick wins. And also if you can't do something now, or you have a bigger plan, then sharing what that is can often make a huge difference. I'm going to jump over to the attendee Q&A because there's a related question right now. This is anonymous. Most of our executives care on some personal level about DEI work, but they don't make it a priority or see it as an important part of our business. This prevents us from really making change on a broad organizational level. I've heard some criticism of the business case for diversity, but I don't know how we communicate that DEI matters without defaulting to that. Any thoughts, Natania?
Oh, so many thoughts. And also, there was a glorious moment that lasted for a couple years, some of us for a couple months, when a lot of the country was really upset about the police murder of George Floyd, when we didn't have to make the business case for diversity. And it was beautiful. And I just soaked that up as much as I could. And we're back. It's like pre-2016 times. And we're having to make this business case again. And I hear you. My feelings about this are, why should we have to make the case for the fact that human beings deserve to experience dignity at work? You can hear the anger, hopefully, in my voice, right? I find that completely despicable. And we do have to hold ourselves accountable to the things that we say that we value. And we're human beings. And sometimes just because I value something doesn't mean I'm actually going to follow through on it, especially when I have a habit that's different. This comparison is an iffy one, but think about an example of I know that when I eat a lot of sugar, it makes me feel sad and low energy. So I shouldn't do it so much. And I objectively think that eating too much sugar is not so great for me, and I want to stop doing it because that's a value that I have. But unless I put some kind of action plan in place to hold myself accountable to that, when it comes time to find a snack, I'm going for my Trader Joe's sour gummies over some vegetables because they're there and they look really good for me. They look really yummy, right? I need an action plan to actually hold myself accountable to the intention that I have. And that's what I see happening with a lot of execs, right? Not that DEI work is vegetables and what they were doing was gummies. The metaphor doesn't extend to that, but we have a way of working that we're used to. We have a way historically of doing business in this country that tells us that only one bottom line matters, and that is how much money we make. And that tells us that the way we treat the human beings who are helping us reach that bottom line is irrelevant to how much money we make. And we know that to not be true. We have a lot of really good data, the business case for DEI, showing us that investing in DEI actually does help the bottom line. We also know that it's the right thing to do regardless of what it's doing to the bottom line, which is where I often feel attention in talking about this. So what do we do about it? My recommendation is to create company-wide goals related to DEI. Just like you have company-wide goals or KPIs or however you do goal setting as a company that might be related to your revenue or your impact, what are your DEI goals organization-wide? Hold yourself accountable to those the same way you hold yourself accountable to the other goals. So maybe that means that the board asks about them in board meetings. Maybe that means that everyone in the company has a goal that cascades up to this overall company-wide goals, and that there are separate goals for each division that are appropriate given the work that that division is doing. Maybe it means that just like the other goals, you check in on these at your quarterly goal check-in meetings, that you get feedback around them at your monthly check-in meetings, or however you do it. In some organizations, this may mean that you put something on paper and then never follow up on it again. I hope that's not the case, and you got some work to do around goal setting. But however you hold yourself accountable, especially at the executive level, right? To what are we measuring that tells us if we are successful, incorporate DEI into that. So that might mean, as a company, what we would like to see is demographic diversity that mirrors the demographic diversity of our potential workforce by X year, right? Or at X%. And also, because a representation is not everything and only tells part of the story, we want to see that across demographic groups, we are seeing that folks are reporting that they're having equitable and inclusive experiences at the organization really consistently at whatever metric we're holding ourselves to with our DEI survey. right? It'll be whatever those goals are that are specific to what your organization is looking to do, but what you measure is what you focus on. So help your executive team figure out how they want to measure their success around this, and then how they want to hold themselves accountable to it.
Something, I'm glad that you mentioned the gummies. Natania loves Trader Joe's gummy candies. I'm going to share this article that Natania wrote for us recently in the chat, because I think one of the things that comes up to when I look at a question like this is, you know, in the article that you wrote, you have this great list of examples of like how DEI can effectively partner with other facets of the business. So like communications and marketing teams, for example, need to make sure that the public facing content they create resonates with diverse audiences and doesn't cause unintentional harm. Like that's a really specific thing that a DEI program at your company could do. I also think that a lot of the folks on the call today are, you know, we know that you're working with volunteer run DEI functions within your companies, and that you're also at like smaller orgs. So I think, Natania, do you have any advice on like the type of goals that you would set with the context of like you have an exec who really wants DEI to like focus on the business outcomes, and let's say you're at a company with less than 100 people, what might that look like?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, Lexi. I think one of the things that I would want to work with that exec to think about is, what are all the other areas in your organization where you assume that you, exec person, do not have the functional expertise needed to carry out that function by yourself, right? There's probably lots of them. And what are all the other areas where you'd never ask somebody from another part of the business to step in and take on that work as an additional part of their workload, if it wasn't part of their job description? There are very few. Often execs assume that they can do HR work or people related work because they're people and they've experienced what it's like to work in organizations. But many of you are probably HR leaders. You know that this is an area of expertise, right? HR folks have developed subject matter expertise about HR. The same is true for DEI. DEI folks have developed subject matter expertise about DEI. And when we ask volunteers to take on that work, the vast majority of the time, the people who step up to take on DEI work in an unpaid way are from historically excluded groups who are already more likely to be paid less for the same work, who are already more likely to be taking on other kinds of volunteer roles in the organization, and are just having a less equitable experience in the organization overall. So what we're doing when we have volunteers take on this work, and I say this hopefully to give you some support if you are some of the volunteers who are doing this, is that we are making DEI worse in our organizations, right? We are creating less equitable and inclusive experiences in the org. And so what I would do, and not to discount the fact that you may be enjoying the DEI work that you're doing, right? Those two things can coexist. I did DEI work as a volunteer before I took it on as my primary area of work, and I loved it. And I also recognized that there were white men who weren't taking it on, who were able to move up way faster in their careers because they had more time to spend on the things that were actually getting covered in their performance reviews, right? Which this volunteer work very rarely is work that leads to promotions and pay increases. So one thing that you can do is show execs some of the articles that talk about, and the one that Lexi just alluded to is one of them, right? That talk about why having volunteers take on DEI work is often really harmful. And then think about who in your organization is responsible for things that are related to the kind of DEI work that your organization wants to be doing. Sometimes that's really internally focused DEI work, and so it might be somebody on the HR team who's going to be the partner there. Sometimes that's DEI work that's really focused on your marketing efforts, and so it makes sense to have an external subject matter expert who really focuses on marketing as related to DEI, partner with someone on your marketing team. But figure out who the right internal partner is, and then bring on an external DEI subject matter expert. If you're fewer than 100 people, it probably doesn't make sense to hire a full-time person to focus on DEI, but find the budget just like you would for any other subject matter area that you value as an area that you need expertise in, to bring on a consultant to work with you, even if it's just a couple hours a month, to help advise you and bring in that subject matter expertise.
Awesome. Thanks for providing that follow-up. And I think one of the things that I was sharing with Natania about the reason that I love this sort of format for a webinar is that oftentimes, if you have a question related to DEI and you mentioned this earlier, Natania, about like typing in for DEI survey questions or something like that, like the answers that the internet is giving you right now are like not great and not specific to your unique situation. So, we still have 30 minutes. We still have a bunch of questions to get through, but please share your questions in the Q&A because we will try to answer them as much as possible live. And if we can't, we'll try to answer them afterwards for you in some follow-up content. So on that note, I'm going to go to the next question from Midnight. And I think this one is one that really, gets at the times that we're working and living in today. So Midnight says, I work in tech where diversity is difficult at the best of times. Most of the areas that are most vulnerable during a RIF, marketing, admin, or sales, tend to also be where you will find a large number of underrepresented folks. What are some strategies to help bring more diversity into less vulnerable sectors of the business during a downturn? That's a big question. And Natania, if you have any follow-ups or clarity, I believe Midnight is still on and we can chat.
Yeah, it's one that we think about all the time. And just for folks who may not know, a RIF is a reduction in force. So we're talking about an organization where there are layoffs going on, usually, as Midnight is alluding to here, because of an economic downturn. So the organization needs to cut their spend, and they're doing that by laying staff off. The answer to this is a little bleak. It's almost impossible to improve demographic diversity when you're not hiring, right? The only way to do it is to make sure that the people that you are letting go are not from underrepresented groups. But if your company hasn't historically invested in recruiting folks from historically excluded groups into areas of the company that are less vulnerable during a downturn, which is not where you see the highest number of applicants from those groups, it's really hard to do that. And as a result, we will very often see this exact outcome. So strategies to bring more diversity into the less vulnerable sectors is exactly what I would focus on, Midnight. I love that that's the way you're framing this. A couple of things that I would think about in the long term for doing that are really thinking about proactively diversifying your network. We very often hire the people that we know or people who know people we know. Is not a very good practice. It's how we end up building homogenous organizations because we know people who look like us. When I look around at my friend group, I see a lot of other white, queer, Jewish women, a lot of other people with disabilities, right? Those are identities that I hold. I actually wind up with a lot of people from California who moved to New York, right? We make friends with people who are very similar to us. There are things that we can do to change that over time by addressing some of our unconscious biases, but it's a very normal adaptive behavior that we have. And so something that we can do professionally around that is to really intentionally intervene in that behavior for ourselves. So that might mean building relationships with organizations where folks from historically excluded groups in your industry tend to gather. Midnight, you work in tech, so that might mean making sure that your organization is building reciprocal relationships with organizations like Afrotech, Lesbians in Tech, Women Who Code. Think like these kinds of organizations where folks who have been historically excluded from tech tend to gather. And when I say reciprocal relationships, I don't mean posting your jobs on those job boards. That might be part of it. What I mean is reaching out to them and figuring out, what do you need that we can offer? right? Are you hosting a hackathon that we can help co-host or participate in? Do you have folks who are looking for jobs at different levels who might want to shadow somebody in our organization for a day? Do you need resources that we can provide for free, right? What does it look like to have an actual substantive ongoing relationship with those organizations so that when you do have open roles available, that pipeline is really natural. You're not just slapping a job post on a job board and hoping that you get good applications, because that's just not how it works. It's usually not successful. And then also thinking about this personally for yourself. So actually taking stock of, okay, in my professional network, what does the demographic spread look like? Who do I see here and who do I not see here? Have your executives do that too, right? If what we're seeing is networks that look mostly like us, what are some events that we might go to where we're more likely to meet folks who don't look like us, right? So that when it comes time to hire, those connections are more readily available, and frankly, so that our work can be informed by those people, because our work is suffering when we are only exposed to perspectives of people who look just like us, right? We want these relationships so that we can build stronger products, so that our work can be stronger, and so that when it comes time to hire later, we can do exactly what Midnight is trying to do here, which is bolster those other areas of the org with folks from historically excluded groups.
Thank you. And Midnight, feel free to chat us if you have a follow-up to that, but hopefully that is a good answer to your question. I'm going to jump back to our pre-submitted list and jump around a little bit to, we had a question about, and this was one of the topic areas that came up for us about cutting costs. So I have at an organization where they are cutting costs and pulling our training budget. What could I focus on instead to drive the importance of DEI in a very immature business?
Yeah, so when we think about DEI work, trainings and workshops are often the first thing that we think about. When I tell people that I'm a DEI consultant, they say, oh, so you like facilitate trainings and workshops and stuff? It's the first thing they ask, which I do. We're doing this right now. I love doing this kind of stuff. This kind of stuff is not what creates long-lasting change. So when I think about the kind of change that I really want to see in organizations, that doesn't come from workshops. Sometimes I think about effective work that organizations can take on in kind of a pyramid shape. And the things that are at the base of the pyramid are things that you can take on in a less mature organization, in a smaller organization, that are really effective. So the base of the pyramid, the stuff that if we don't do it, everything else comes crumbling down, that we have to start with first, is figuring out how we're going to hold ourselves accountable to our DEI goals. I mean, actually having DEI goals in the first place. So oftentimes I'll get brought in for a training that's like, can you teach us about gender in the workplace? And I'll say, sure, why? Why do you care about gender in the workplace? Oh, because we've heard that women and non-binary folks in our organization are having some experiences that aren't so great. Oh, bummer. What do you care? What do you want to do about that? What are you hoping happens in the long term? What we usually get to is, well, we want to have an organization where folks are having equitable experiences regardless of their gender identity. Awesome. Is that a goal that you have? How can we make that a measurable goal in the long term that you're going to hold yourself accountable to? That's the base of the pyramid, right? If we do the training and we don't have that goal in place, people come to the training, especially folks who are not from historically oppressed gender groups, so cis men, walk out of the training and feel like, oh, I did my good feminism thing, and now I'm a good feminist, good job me, and then go out into the world and keep doing misogynist stuff. The same is true for white people. I'm not just calling out men here, or people from any other historically oppressor group, right? If we have that strategy in place at the base of our pyramid, then what we can put in at the next level of the pyramid, this middle section, is what systems and structures do we have in place in our organization to make sure that we are actually able to hold ourselves accountable to those goals. So maybe we have some goals about gender representation in our workforce, and in our middle level of the pyramid is where we're thinking about, okay, how do we hire? So in addition to building relationships with organizations, in this case, let's go back to Midnight's question, like women in tech, right? How are we thinking about the qualifications for each of our open roles? How are we screening resumes? What information are we redacting from resumes? How are we designing our interview questions? How are we scoring candidates when they respond to interview questions? What does that whole process look like? When we're ready for promotions, what's the process we go through for performance evaluations? When we're giving and receiving feedback, what's the process that we use for that? I can go on and on. There are so many systems and structures in an organization that impact people's experiences and disproportionately negatively impact women and non-binary folks and help men, right? So that's our middle level of this pyramid, which you can totally do without a training budget. And instead, your HR team working with a DEI subject matter expert to help bring that expertise into policy building. Then finally, once all of that is done, we might do some trainings, because maybe folks in the organization need to learn how to use those equitable systems that we have created effectively. And that's what the trainings can focus on. So we might do a training about gender in the workplace, and we might do some teaching about what is gender and how is it different from sex and how is it different from sexual orientation and what are all the genders that are out there I don't understand. But the point of learning about that is going to be what we hopefully focus the workshop on, which is what are gender biases and how are those impacting how I interact with my colleagues? And what does my organization expect of me in terms of policy and systems and structures and practices that we have that can help me make sure that I'm treating my colleagues more equitably across gender identities. So the limited budget, not focusing on training, I would focus on those first two levels of the pyramid. What are the goals that we have around DEI, and what are the systems and structures that we're using to hold ourselves accountable to them?
Awesome, thank you. We really have a wide range of questions here and are just pulling on all the years of your experience, Natania. So thank you for answering anything at this point.
Yeah, having fun. Really good stuff come up in the initial mentee, so happy to keep pulling on that.
Yeah, we can definitely pop back in there. Let's go to one more question. Let's take the other anonymous question, then we can pop back to the mentee. The anonymous question here is a specific one, and I think a great one, which is, how do I make sure that I am paying equitably, considering some marginalized groups may not have had career opportunities to gain experience, but have the right skill set for the job?
I love this question, anonymous attendee. Thank you for asking. So this gets at really, how do we hire, right? And what do we think about when we're trying to figure out what the qualifications are for a role? I have a hiring framework that I use for this that actually PIN uses now. And if you want to learn more about it, reach out. I do trainings on this. What I always start with is, first of all, we want to make sure that the skill set that you're looking for and the experience that you're looking for is actually necessary for the things that you need this person to do. So what we'll start with is figuring out, what are the actual organizational objectives or business objectives for this role? Not what are the tasks this person needs to do every day, because some people accomplish the same goal by doing very different tasks, and that might be fine. But if I needed to make the business case to my CEO or my chairperson of the board who doesn't have time for the small details, what would I tell them about the impact that this role is going to have on the business, right? What are the big picture things I need this person to accomplish? Let's list those out. And then let's look at, in order to be able to accomplish those things, what are the qualifications that a person needs to be able to do those things well? Now's where we get to your question. Some of those things are going to be, in order to do this, I need the person to have done something similar in the past. I don't have the bandwidth to teach them. It's totally reasonable to expect that a person would have had the opportunity to do this kind of thing in the past, because it's not so unique and niche that we only do it in one way in our organization, right? Or it's just something that is just reasonable to expect, is one bucket of things. But if we think about it, there's probably more things that fall exactly in what you're talking about, which is, do they have the capacity to be able to do this? Do they have a skill set that tells me that if I put this task in front of them, they could accomplish it well? And we need to differentiate between those two things by stating our qualifications really clearly. So if the qualification is they need to have experience doing this kind of thing successfully, say that. But if the qualification is they need to have the capacity to do X, Y, and Z, or they need to have these skill sets because it's important to be able to do X, Y, and Z, say that instead. And then design an evaluation that actually gets at that. So if the evaluation is, if the qualification is they need to have experience successfully fundraising at least $500,000 a year for 5 years, because this is something they're going to have to do over and over again, and we don't have time to teach them, then what we're going to do to evaluate is probably ask them, tell me about how you've brought in over $5,000 a year for 5 years, right? We're going to look for that on their resume. But if instead the qualification is, well, if they've had a little bit of fundraising experience, or if they've had experience talking to strangers really well and getting strangers to trust them or new people to get excited about their idea, right? Then they have enough of a skill set and they can figure out how to do this job and probably do it really well. Then assess for that. Tell me about a time when you needed to convince somebody to do something they hadn't done, or to donate to a cause, or to come with you to an activity. How did you convince them of it? Is a great question to help you figure out if they have that skill set. So really narrowing in on what is the actual qualification, and is the evaluation that I'm doing aligned with helping me figure out that they have that qualification, is where you'll get that expansiveness and that freedom to weed people in instead of weeding people out.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned the hiring sort of interview survey that we used at Penn, and I'll just give a shout out for that as well, because I've worked at a few different startups. I've been involved in a lot of hiring panels, and it's never a good feeling to go and, you're filling out your interview survey and you're just kind of like, well, this is how I felt and this is what I thought, and I liked this person, the end. I think it really is helpful to have a guideline that helps you interview better. And we owe that to candidates, to give them an equitable hiring experience. So just a shout out for that. It's very effective. And I've shared the Mentimeter again. Can you see this, Natania? Okay, great. Since I've been feeding you the questions, do you want to pick one? Pick one that excites you?
Yeah, I have the window positioned so that I am actually looking at my camera instead of my screen. So let me reposition it so I can read the questions.
Okay, and then there's one that I kind of can't fit into the scroll, which this one off the screen is how to approach DEI as a people ops team of one when leadership aren't very invested in this work. And then there's the rest on the screen here.
Okay, cool. Let's do that one that we can't see. Can you?
Okay, yeah.
So how to approach DEI as oh, we lost it.
Oh, wait, I thought I made it bigger.
You did. I just did. Yep, you did. Wow. How to approach DEI as a people ops team of one when leadership aren't very invested in the work. So we've covered a little bit of this already. And so I hope that you'll take the applicable answers from the things that we've already talked about around getting leadership accountability and things like that. The reason why I picked this question is one thing that we haven't talked about is level of buy-in and what to do when what this question hits on. Oh, Zoe, thank you for those kind words. When we have some folks in an organization who are really bought in and love the idea of doing DEI work, getting at our first question here, right, about there being different attitudes towards DEI in different parts of the world, and some folks who may be really dismissive of DEI work for lots of reasons, right? Some people are dismissive of DEI work because they don't think that systemic oppression is real. Other people are really dismissive of DEI work because they've been part of DEI work before and it's really burned them. They've seen it be really ineffective, right? One of the early questions here about what's a white woman's role in DEI work is a really important one, because there are a lot of white people, especially white women, doing DEI work in really harmful ways, right? And so you often see folks from other marginalized groups not want to get involved in DEI work because that's the DEI work they've been involved with in the past. And they very rightfully don't want to get hurt like that again. There are lots of legitimate reasons why people are not bought in, not interested in DEI. When we look at effective DEI work, I think of it as there's like two different ways that you can go in and focus. There are some great folks who do really beautiful DEI work. It's all about changing hearts and minds. It's all about helping us. There's like wonderful AI tools out there now. I'm sorry, VR tools out there now. I'm getting all of my tech acronyms mixed up, where people can have virtual reality experiences that help them do some perspective taking and start to get a little bit of understanding about what it might be like to walk through the world or have certain experiences if their identity were different, right? That help people do a lot of really good personal reflection to start to understand how their experiences of the world are different from other people's and why it might be really important to value DEI. I love that work, and I'm not awesome at it. It's not where I tend to focus. I work with colleagues who are really awesome at that work, and I'll often bring them in as partners. What I'm really interested in is behavior. Something that I'll say when I'm feeling particularly blunt, which I am today, is I don't actually, if I'm working with you, like just in an office setting, I don't particularly care what's in your heart and mind. I care what you do. If you think that disabled women are less capable of doing work well and you don't want to work with them, it's a real bummer to be you. But I don't really care as long as you actually treat me well, right? As long as you pay me what I deserve to be paid, if you listen to me in meetings, take me, like if your behavior is aligned with what I want to see, then that's what matters. And so when we're working with folks who are not bought in to DEI, what I want to focus on is, that's fine, you don't need to be bought in, but here are the systems and structures and policies at our organization that everyone who's part of our organization needs to abide by, just as part of being an employee here. Doesn't matter why, it's just what you have to do. So you don't need to be bought into DEI work to use the hiring system that is just the hiring system we use in this organization. And you don't need to be bought into DEI work to go through the performance evaluation system that's just the performance evaluation system that we use here. And you don't need to be bought into DEI work to figure out your new hire's salary based on the equitable salary band system that we've put in place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So when we have that lack of buy-in, what I want to focus on, and regardless, what I want to focus on is not what you think or feel, but what you do. Because the reverse can often be true. We have folks whose hearts and minds are in a beautiful place and their actions are terrible, right? This is true for all of us. We're human beings, right? So when we focus on what's the behavior, what's the system that we want you to use, that's actually when we see really good change organizationally anyway. So I would just focus there. And if they don't want to talk about DEI about it, you don't have to.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and we have just 2 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap us up, which is to say thank you, Natania, for answering all of these questions. Thank you to everyone for attending today and asking your questions. We hope that you got a lot out of today's session. And in the follow-up, we'll send the recording, a link to Natania's website. Tessa just dropped in a link to Natania's LinkedIn. And we will also send some of the articles we'll send all of the articles that Natania has written for us at PIN on DEI and HR and DEI and employee journey mapping. So thank you, Natania. And thanks everybody for coming. Anything you want to add at the end, Natania?
No, it's been a total pleasure. Thank you so much, Lexi. And thank you to everyone who asked such thoughtful questions. I hope it was useful for you. And if you have follow-ups, don't hesitate to be in touch.
Yeah. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Bye.